First day, so I want to welcome everybody to Screenplay. Yeah, please don't put your hand to crush it. My name is Jeremy Antley, and I'm on the Theorizing Web Committee, but I'm also really happy and proud to know the following three panelists we have today. If you are aware of what's going on kind of in general culture, but in just larger areas, games are increasingly becoming something that people are studying and turning an increasing critical eye towards. And so the three panelists we have today are each going to present what I think is fairly unique and a fairly interesting take that you probably would not get in something like any mainstream side or games journalism. This is going to be some really interesting perspectives from people that are doing what I feel, and I think you will agree at the end, is some cutting edge and interesting work. So, y'all decide who wants to go first. All right. So the first one we have today is Catherine Goodfellow, and Catherine is so nice to have come down here. And she and I share similar interests. We both do kind of Russian history stuff, Russian culture, and life, and so she is going to have this wonderful talk today. Actually, we're going to put hers up so it's not. That would probably help.
Yeah, okay.
Hey, man. There we go. Does that look good? Okay, great. So you can just tell me when you want to move a slide or when you want. We lost our clicker. We had clickers. Someone I walked over the clicker. Okay, good. You want to do that? All right. Thank you. So we'll start with Catherine.
Okay, let's have a look at my slides and then can everyone hear me okay? Okay, great.
It's okay to move up to the front too. You can fill in the front seats because it will actually help for hearing.
And you can listen to me.
Yeah, everyone wants to close.
So anyway, Jeremy gave me a lovely introduction, and here I am again. I'm on Twitter to get my sensibilities. And as he identified, I'm actually a nationalist. I'm not exposed to the internet being theory person. So I come at the concept of games from a slightly different angle, and that's in the context of my PhD research. I'm researching Russian gaming communities, practices, identities, and kinds of discourse that are online in Russia about games. Because I'm kind of 1 foot in the camp, I have two very different sets of talks than I usually do. So I go to a game studies conference, and I know none of you are paying any attention to anything except America. And that's terrible, and you should feel bad, and I'm going to talk about Russia. And then the other conference I go to, I go to my teams, I go to a Russian studies conference, and I say there's something called the internet.
Okay.
So I'm
Can you turn the mixer real quick and just make sure that the sound is on?
I realized when I first
You
started
switch over
doing
here.
research that that mentality can be really useful.
USB audio, got it.
Required to take an explicit approach from Russian studies or an explicit approach from game studies. But it also can really trip you up. So for this talk, I'll just outline what I'm going to do. I'm going to use the concept of empire and also the idea of cultural proximity and outline how Russian games and Russian discourse about games is alive in Eastern Europe and what the kinds of discussions are, and how specifically Russian games work as a kind of, ideological vehicle in wider Eastern Europe. Okay, so let's talk about the mistake I made when I started my PhD, and I will translate this somewhere. I delivered a survey. I posted it on Russian language gaming sites, and I said to my supervisor, I'm going to study Russian video game players. And then I got the survey results back, and I realized that lots of my respondents were Russian speaking, but not actually Russian. And I went to the analytics for a couple of these sites. These are the Google Analytics for Habra, which is kind of a overarching video game site. And this is not so relevant, but this right here, 73.5 million page views from Russia, 19.1 from Ukraine, 3.7 for Moderator, and then Kazakhstan, Germany, Latvia, and so on, all the way down. And similarly, Zoha, 63.5% of their visitors are located in Russia, but 18.5% from Ukraine, almost 10% from other countries. Again, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Germany, the US, and Canada, and I don't know what the 2,000 Canadians are doing there, but I didn't know it was important. So, when I look at that, I really have to bring up the idea of empire, right? I really have to start thinking critically about the ways in which Russian games are consumed and how Russian language sites might be really important to people who are into video games but don't speak English, which, remember, is much more likely in Eastern Europe. And I know it's a risky prospect coming to New York and saying, sorry America, you're not that important, but I'm sorry. You know, and then Russia is trying to invade Ukraine and I'm here talking about empire and it all feels a bit close to me. Anyway, empire. These are my questions to the talk. What does empire look like right now in post-Soviet countries? Can we use empire and cultural proximity to help understand Eastern European power dynamics in games? And this is my very recent, hastily added, topical research question. How is gaming as a soft power work right now, given everything that's going on in Eastern Europe? So let me be clear about what I mean when I say empire. My starting point was a book called Games of Empire, which follows Hart and Levy's concept of empire as a kind of networked, decentered, multi-layered system of global capitalism. They theorize that empire in this case consists of a number of nodes or actors from NGOs, transnational corporations, nation states, and so on. They emphasize the importance of immaterial labor, that's work involving information and communication. And based on that sort of loose and very, very briefly summarized theory, they suggest that video games are kind of the perfect medium of empire. They represent a kind of planetary, military hypercapitalism that imposes and reinforces the idea of the worker and the soldier. And I like this. I think it's intrinsically useful, especially as companies are increasingly transnational, and you do have to look at the flows of capital, and Dan's going to talk about Marxism later, so I'm not going to tread on his toes. But I had some problems with it, and first and foremost, as a Russianist, I thought it was really focused on North America. It claimed to be a transnational theory, but the case studies that were chosen and the kind of presentation of the theory, I thought, didn't really give due weight to the idea of the nation state and sort of national identity and international relations, I guess would be the phrase. Bart Simon, reviewing the book, he calls this vector politics, and he says the book essentially asks the question, at any moment do our actions reproduce empire or do they unsettle it? Which again I found a little bit limited and quite restrictive. But this whole idea of games as a vehicle for ideology, I did like. And I think it works quite well if you replace the US and the world with Russia and Eastern Europe. So if that makes sense to you, great, well done. And let's talk about cultural proximity, which is much easier to understand, because it's exactly what it sounds like. It's the notion that certain cultures are intrinsically closer and more compatible to yours or to a given variable, I guess, than others. And in a really great article on East Asian gaming, Dean Chan says, Eastern Asian online game design and marketing create notions of perceived cultural proximity within the region. And he asks about the cultural politics, and then he says, so this is brilliant, because I don't have to compare things to the West. I can just talk about Russia and Eastern Europe. So how does cultural proximity work, I guess, to enhance ideas of empire, and how are games a part of that? Well, we'll start with language. Language is an official language in Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan, and it's a significant secondary language in about 12 more countries. Beth Kolko and Cynthia Putnam wrote an article about gaming in Central Asia, and they found that people who speak Russian speaking Russian is a more accurate predictor for playing video games than almost anything else, including socioeconomic status and speaking English. So the Russian language becomes kind of a really easy access point to gaming in the region. Recently, the Kremlin said that Moscow will strive to protect the interests of Russians and Russian speakers wherever they may be, which is horrifying. But RFDRL has this really great map where they pointed out where the Russian speakers, the ethnic Russians and the Russian passport holders kind of generally are, and when you look at this, you can see that language, and this is only, used quite limited blocks that are pointed out. There's a lot further than my tiny map, but I thought that was a really nice sort of visual representation of where exactly Mr. Putin is casting his net. And as a Russian speaker, that's a little bit freaky as well. So there's that. We've also got the idea of shared history. In her amazing book, Russia Inventing a Nation, Vera Talks outlines 5 intellectual debates over what Russia is or should be. And it's a fairly recent book, it's about 10 years old, I think. And I'm going to actually read those out because I think these are really useful. So these are public, intellectual and political debates about what Russia is as a nation. So number 1, the union identity. The Russians defined as an imperial people or as a people with a mission to create a supranational state. Number 2, the Russians as a nation of all Eastern Slavs, united by a common origin and culture. 3, the Russians as a community of Russian speakers, regardless of ethnic origin. 4, the Russians defined racially. And 5 would be a kind of civic Russia who have allegiance to a constitution rather than to ethnicity or language or history. And I bring that up because I think that this is an example of the supranational train of thought and what is the creation of a supranational state other than empire building, right? Please no one correct me on that was off the cuff. And the last thing would be market demographics and infrastructure in our factors that would facilitate and encourage an empire. I don't know how visible that is, it's pretty tiny, but the Moscow Times and also the BBC covered this, a protest happening in Ukraine where people are boycotting Russian goods. And the really important part here is this final paragraph. Someone created an app called Boycott the Occupiers that lets you scan a barcode and figure out whether it's a Russian product or not. This last sentence here, in 2 sentences, many products one would normally identify as Western are considered by local activists as Russian. So Nestle and Nestle, they're Swiss, but their products in the Ukrainian market are produced in Russia. And there are also examples like Greenfields tea sounds super English, super Russian. And that's actually Russian cooking. And within Russia itself, we've got a series of political discourses that incorporate games into the list of media that many politicians feel should be kind of subject to some kind of sometimes censorship, sometimes sort of counter-information type campaigns. And just generally there's been a debate on the extent to which the government should be intervening in game making, should be sponsoring it, should be encouraging a certain kind of Russian games to be made. So Pavel Zorianov, the auditor of the Committee of New Policy, says what we need is more programs to have patriotic education, who are on the right ideological level. He talks about affecting the consciousness of young people who learn history, adopt values, and he says it's important this process is given a pro-Russian background. And in the government roundtable, Pavel Tarashanov said computer games have great impact on the minds of young people. The task of the state must be to make computer games developed by young people, and at the same time, preserve the moral and ethical standards of our society, strengthen and promote traditional values. And in the news, Oleg Savchenko of the Videogames has said that if people are going to make media about Russian history, then there has to be truth to it, otherwise it could be seen as a deliberate provocation. He adds, quote, the spreading of false information online about events in the past should be punished without exception. And and Mikhail defends as well. Mikhail is kind of a clown if you're not really okay with Russian politics, but he dredged this up from somewhere and suggested that video games should sort of be subject to this process of scrutiny. Here he is again. And I think this is a really telling quote at the bottom. He envisions fines for, quote, dissemination of false information that includes either the merits of those who died defending the fatherland, or the authority of the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, the Russian Federation, and its armed forces. Just kind of rolling all that in together under one empire. But, I don't think this idea of Russian Empire through video games is entirely crazy. Something's going to be that bad. Okay, so I'm just going to go through a few images and then I'm going to wrap it up. I thought I'd show you some pictures, because everyone loves pictures and word to have. And these are 3 games that are Russian made over the past 10 years. None of them, to my knowledge, are government sponsored, but I think they all kind of show some interesting cultural Russianness, I guess you'd say. And I've actually written an article about this in fun detail, so you can ask me for that if you're interested. This is from Metro 2033, a Russian game made in a Ukrainian studio based on a Russian book. And that would be a lovely depiction of the Moscow metro system. This is Arlen's Online. It's made by Mail.ru, which is one of the biggest Russian internet companies. And this is one of the first cities you get to, and I'm going to stand in the projector and show you some very kind of Russian elements of this. Kiosks. Common apartments, you can walk inside those and they are common apartments. And this amazing kind of government building, you actually go to this government building and you have to find the right forms and all this. And that's the top of the building, which is kind of very Seven Sisters-y. If you've seen the Seven Sisters in Moscow, that's very welcome. And this is Ideologies, which is a World War II flight simulator, and it really kind of taps into this Russian passion for all things military, I think. So architecture, forms of commemoration, town planning, jabs at Russian bureaucracy, references to cartoons like Chegarashka, questions about Lavanya, and military history, all very much in evidence in these games, even if they are not directly sort of sponsored or encouraged by the government. So to wrap this up, I think it's pretty clear that games really do function as a vehicle for the kinds of ideology that Leotard, Winfred, and Preface of Games of Empire point out. I tend to think that in this kind of historical and cultural context, capital is not the most productive theories of capital are not the most productive. I think looking at national identity, at nation building, at common language, culture, history, these are way more important. So I'd like to propose a slightly different hierarchy of interests. I would say these things are government sponsored or not, pro-Russian, first and foremost pro-Russian, often anti-US, or at the very least anti-US, often overtly military. They draw upon recognizable cultural, architectural, linguistic, and historical similarities and tropes. And there's certainly an element of, there's certainly kind of market forces at play here, particularly when you look at piracy in Russian language games. But more often than not, I think this is a really interesting example of media as soft power, and gaming as a really convenient sleeper vehicle for pro-Russian ideology, especially right now. Okay, I'm going to leave this there and let Cameron have a word. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. That's awesome. I mean, that is like home for me. Like, that's great to see all that kind of stuff. It's very fun. So I hope you all enjoy that. Up next, we're going to have Daniel, and he's going to come in and speak, and I'm just going to let you do your thing.
Howdy, everybody. I'm Daniel Joseph. I'm a PhD researcher in Toronto, Ontario, at Ryerson and York Universities. And I hate slides. I never make PowerPoint presentations. I think they're a waste of time. Not that I don't appreciate everyone else's amazing PowerPoint presentations.
Sure.
Yeah, I just don't do them myself. So, anyway, so I will now talk at you. anyway, there's no rush with that kind of stuff. So, so last year, Eric Zimmerman, he's a game designer and professor at the NYU Game Center, wrote a manifesto for a ludic century. So here are the various points. So the first point is games are ancient. Games are, like ontologically related to an earlier part of human existence. They've been around for a long time. Games are, so digital technology gives games new relevance. In fact, Eric says games were proto-computers that gave rise to computers that we know today. Number 3 is the 20th century was the century of information. So echoing the sociologist Daniel Bell's theories about the industrial information societies and post-industrial information societies of the 20th century. Number 4 is in the 21st century, information has taken a playful turn. Number 5 is the moving image was the dominant cultural form of the 20th century. So movies were what really mattered in the 20th century. Number 6, the ludic century is the era of games. So it says, when information is put at play, game-like experiences replace linear media, and media is increasingly systemic, modular, and customizable. Number 7, he says, we live in a world of systems, so all our interactions are based on the movement of information, and thus games are the perfect fit for this new interlocking world that we live in. Number 8, there is a need to be playful, so it is not enough to be systems literate. One must also learn to be playful in these systems. Number 9 is we should think like designers, so we can't be passive. We have to be making our own games as well. Number 10 is games are literacy, so just as reading and film literacy is a thing, game literacy is also really important. Number 11 is gaming literacy can address our problems, so how does the price of gas in California affect the politics in the Middle East? So these are questions that games and ludic kind of strategies can answer. Number 12 is in the ludic century, everyone will be a game designer, so the split between game players and game designers is increasingly more, like it's murky. Are you making games when you're playing games? Things like that. And number 13, so games are beautiful. They don't need to be justified. They just are amazing. So this presentation is a gesture towards what a materialist theory of a ludic century is. So the goal here isn't so much to debunk such visions as like idealist utopianism or kind of like bourgeois fantasy about the world, but rather is to make sense of the tendencies that Zimmerman has seen in our society and what this might mean for both an analytic understanding of such a system as well as a political one. This is then entirely a kind of a priori, like before I haven't done any research really. I'm just like making like what I've seen, I'm just trying to make sense of it. Let's see here. So the research I have done so far mostly just points towards the hard research to come. So right now I'm relying on my first-hand experiences with a whole variety of games, but specifically the ones developed by Valve Software. So I'm talking about today is CounterStrike Global Offensive, which is a game that came out a few years ago. If you aren't familiar with CounterStrike, it is quite simply an online first-person shooter or FPS. And CounterStrike is primarily arranged around two teams playing 3-minute games, where the two teams, terrorists versus counter-terrorists, face off against each other in various simulated environments. So if you're all familiar with like Call of Duty or anything like that, very similar kind of game. People with guns shoot at each other. Let's see. What makes this version of CounterStrike interesting is that it was released with the full integration into the Valve marketplace with real money transfers, which was first developed for the game Team Fortress 2. Steam is Valve's digital distribution service that was first created to distribute game updates and patches to Valve games, but was then later transformed into a digital rights and distribution service, whose success as a digital mall prefigures a lot of the other distribution services we take for granted, like Netflix. The reason this marketplace exists is to trade and exchange weapon skins, weapon skin crates, and crate keys. While in-game marketplaces have existed in online video games for a while now, what is particularly unique, though still not unprecedented, is the real money transfer element of the entire service. So the difference between in-game markets and real money transfer markets is a simple one. In the former, players barter, exchange, and engage in arbitrage inside the game entirely, so often but not always with no way to input outside funds into the game. But the latter, the real money transfer system, involves the ability to put money into the game as well as to take it out. So CounterStrike for me is exemplary of a tendency rather than a singularity. So the goal is for me is to use it as this tendency to make sense or to draw out this kind of Weberian spirit of the age in some way. So are the logics of this CounterStrike game the animating spirit of what Eric Zimmerman called the Ludic century? So in what ways are the logics of CounterStrike different or exemplary of what Zimmerman has described? So there are kind of two things I want to address really quickly. First is the body of literature about work, play, and virtual environments and games in the field of game studies, which there's quite a bit of, and I won't go too into depth into that, and the work of the economist Yanis Varoufakis. In game studies, the problem has been historically posed in Western-centric, humanist, in the philosophical sense terms. So this is baggage left over primarily from the work of Johann Huizinga, who was an Orientalist but dabbled in pseudo-anthropology and generated a theory of man and play, his Homo Ludens. Building off this came Calois, whose sociology was, constructing more typologies of games and play. These ludologies pose ideal conceptions of what games and play are, rather than historical and specific ones, which in part explain the better part of the decade that was dedicated to arguing about what a game even is and what play even is. So if you've ever read any of the game studies literature, the first 10 years was like, are these games? Are these not games? Are they literature? Are they, what? Anyway, so there's a lot of it, anyway. A lot of ink has been spilled over this in my field, and if you want to know more, I can direct you to that. So this is something like this whole problem was kind of foregrounded by Mark Silverman and Bart Simon in their 2009 article, Discipline and Dragon Kill Points in the Online Power Game. They believe that work and play distinction is really critical and unavoidable to think about when we're theorizing games. So for them, work and play as we know it rise in relation to the class-based experiences of industrial society. And they say, and I quote, "It comes about that, in modernity, one has to play because one works, and play in this sense has no significant meaning outside of its relationship to work." End quote. So, yet in recognizing that work and play as we know them are products of a class-based society, Simon and Silverman propose a different path towards understanding how games mediate work and play. So they think that reducing them only to a new form of alienation is too simple, and that they reflect other tendencies that escape this kind of classically Marxist dialectical relation. For them, Foucault's genealogical analysis is better to reveal the currents of production, desire, instrumentality, and power in games like Everquest, an early, massively multiplayer online game, if you're all familiar with it. It's created by Sony Online Entertainment, one of the first big networked online multiplayer games with digital backgrounds and all that kind of stuff. So they do this with a study of the Dragon Kill Point system, which I will explain. So, which was instituted in some online guilds in Everquest through the foil of the Power Gamer. So the Power Gamer for Simon and Silverman is the most instrumental of all subjects. So these are what we might call today hardcore gamers. These are the gamers that, as T.L. Taylor describes it, have a, quote, focus on efficiency and instrumental orientation, dynamic goal setting, a commitment to understanding the underlying game systems and structures, and technical and skill proficiency, end quote. So the Power Gamer is a kind of subjectivity that would join guilds to play high-level content in games like Everquest, EVE Online, World of Warcraft. The kind of guilds whose application forms often require more information commitment than most job resumes. If you've ever seen these application forms, there's 20 points. One of them is you must have time for us, you must be able to be dedicated, you must take on a role. It's actually often more work than being in organizing a conference is what I imagine actually. Probably takes more time. What is key for Silverman and Simon is that these power gamers, in dialogue with the institutions of guilds in online games, have created an interesting and new form of governance and power, as embodied in this, again, this Dragon Kill Point system. While I don't have time to go into depth about it here, what made it interesting was that the Dragon Kill Point system was designed to incentivize group play without resorting to more autocratic forms of control. So by producing a kind of currency inside the guild associated with a certain amount of game labor, members would trade that currency to increase the likelihood of winning new loot. So the whole idea was that if you engage in a raid, you would get some of these this fake money that you could then put forward again to be able to win more things down the road. So it was to instrumentalize play. While this might have been the goal of the Dragon Kill Point system, that doesn't mean that it actually produced this kind of behavior. So Silverman and Simon instead prefer to wonder why the activities that power gamers engaged in would be amenable to economic analysis. So while I agree that such a Foucaultian analysis is interesting and productive, I'm still interested in the economics of the dragon kill point system, and that's not working, as well as the economics arising from other online game-like contexts. So Silverman and Simon return to this question in their conclusions, though. They say that one could interpret power gamers as the logical conclusion of George Ritzer's thesis about the McDonaldization of everything, that play is increasingly becoming just as awful as the most routine service jobs, but they prefer a different interpretation. The power gamers are not workers, nor are they like workers. Rather, they are hyperworkers. So, key to this argument about hyperworkers is that they aren't producing value. They produce nothing and consume nothing. Instead, they produce a simulacrum, as they say it, of post-industrial work. So they play at working in the ways that post-industrial workers work. This is justified by suggesting, without a full political economy, that power gamers are likely a sap on the resources of MMO production companies, and that they are actually consuming at an accelerated rate the content which is supposed to be doled out to the rest of the players. I don't think that without conducting a full political economy of a company like Sony Online Entertainment, we could ever really understand the different dynamics of resource consumption on every different kind of player. But we can take into account power gamers and all gamers as value-producing workers. While in some sense the playing at work element is true, the reality is that video game production captures value at 2 points in the productive process. The first is in the studio, where surplus value is extracted through the wage. And the second is in the production of new forms of effective labor that produce immaterial forms of value that are captured through a variety of mechanisms. So, as I say, case in point is this thing, the Steam Marketplace, which has been scrolling back and forth for a while now. So, one person who studied the Steam Marketplace for a while is the economist and one-time Valve researcher Yanis Varoufakis. His public work was boiled down into 3 really interesting blog posts, and I highly recommend you go onto the Valve website. He's got 4 of them. It was Valve Economics is what it was called. All of this was prior to the creation of real money transfers. How much time?
No, you got time. You got 5 minutes.
5 minutes? Okay. Yeah. So one of the things is he goes through the kind of different possibilities. Like some players can engage in arbitrage. They can make money. They can make trades that benefit them over the long run if they trade low, like buy low, sell high kind of thing. He talks about the internal structural organization of Valve itself, which is kind of famous for having a non-hierarchical workplace environment, so there's no bosses at Valve. He also talks about the kind of value systems that online economies have. So instead of everyone just being out to seek a profit, there's often systems of debt, of friendship, of a lot of gift economies in these online systems. So, but I'm more interested in the marketplace, what's going on here. So, let me explain how digital economies are produced in CounterStrike Global Offensive. A game is played, and at the end of the round, there are a series of drops. These drops can then be 2 kinds of items: weapon skins, paint jobs for guns, and then other weapon skins can be used for The weapon skins can be used immediately by the player. For the cases that are dropped, the player must use a key, which is then sold by Valve at a set price. When the player uses this key on the case, a randomized drop is initiated and a weapon skin is produced. The skin could be rare or common. It is functionally a random chance. At this point, depending on the kind of skin or case one has received, the player can choose to keep, trade, or sell it. If one trades the item, it is an instance of what Varoufakis calls like an ideal type of barter. So I want to get rid of something, and it just so happens we want the exact same kind of thing. No money has to be exchanged. But say if there isn't someone who wants it for, like trade of, pure barter kind of system, then you can use money. So, the player can then set her own price on the Steam Marketplace. Say someone agrees to this price and buys it. At this point, and this is exactly what I'm interested in, Valve takes a cut of the sale. So this is called the Steam transaction fee, and it is currently set at 5% of the cost and is paid by the buyer. The money made from this sale goes into the player's Steam wallet. The cut that Valves take, this is what I'm interested in. Think of how value is being produced. I play a game and Valve gives me an object whose marginal cost, the cost to produce the next copy, is functionally 0. I then take this commodity and sell it to someone else who wants it. I'm going to assume that this other player puts money into their Steam wallet to buy it now. They pay for it using money from outside the game and give it to me, with Valve shaving off a specific percentage. They have captured value without actually selling me anything. So they didn't sell me this object that was created in the game for free, but someone else bought it, so they shaved off a part of that transaction from the other person. So no, Steam did not actually sell me anything. They have profited off of being an intermediary of the sale. The only sunk cost was the cost of the artist that Valve employed in creating the skin. But even then, most of these skins for the weapons and the kind of things that are dropped are actually created by the community themselves. There's competitions and stuff, so no one was actually paid to create this. While certainly some players can still be able to gain advantage through a deft read of the marketplace and engage in, kind of arbitrage again, buying low, selling high, they still pay the Valve toll. So, and there's this kind of like amazing like little quote that I think we should all look at really quick. So I just want to like, as kind of a,
This is Daniel's Tumblr site, right?
yeah, so if you want to read more things that I'm talking about. So look at this amazing kind of like, so let's just scroll down to here. So take this transaction for instance. I bought something for $10 from them. They gave me a mythic in-game item as a bonus. When I sell that item for $25, they take approximately $3.25 out of that. I then spend 13 of that on a game, of which they take a third. So that's another $4.22. That totals $7.57 that they have made back from me already. Now if I purchase another game with another 10 that I have left, they take another third. This will give them over $10, which means I bought an item for $10, but they actually made over 20 on the sale. Fucking genius. So,
my friend.
Yeah, this is someone I know on the internet. What's really key here, I think, is that coming back to this whole thing about like Eric Zimmerman's Ludic Century is that I suppose this means that it's worth thinking about this some more. Is this the Ludic Century becoming real as Zimmerman speculates? It could be very well that if the current trends in capitalism hold, as Thomas Piketty predicts, that is, if the rate on the return of wealth outpaces national growth. So economists predict this means a deepening of the crisis and a shift towards low but predictable returns of all kinds, scraped from any part of life possible. If this is exactly the kind of rents extracted by Valve from small commodities resembles. So it isn't ridiculously profitable. Again, it's only 5% off of every sale, but it is just profitable enough. This is the kind of virtual spatial fix that I'm working on with a friend. This is kind of a modification of David Harvey's theory about spatial fixes and geographic, like moving problems in capitalism into new geographic spaces. And I'm basically, one of the big arguments is that fixing capitalism is now moving into these kinds of new spaces online in these games and finding ways to just take as much little, like shave off money in every way possible in different spaces. So this is the kind of, at the same time, Silverman and Simon's theory of hyperworkers increasingly begins to fade. So once, while society could play at being post-industrial workers and those kinds of guilds and things like that, the trend of gamification, which is the same process in the opposite direction, make work into a game while play is increasingly work-like. What is likely to happen is that wages and extraction of surplus value will increasingly become as important both during the official workday while an increasing massive play games for both pleasure and, so it'll be, important during the official workday, while an increasing massive play for pleasure and profit will, basically be important for creating value for like Valve and things like that. So imagine this kind of rentier relationship existing at every level of your work and leisure life. So 5% here and there, and it increasingly seems like Valve really has prefigured whatever it is to live, if not in a post-industrial society, a kind of like a Ludustrial society, this kind of like new form of capitalism or whatever it is. So yeah, and I'll shut up now. Yeah, all right. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. And it's good that you brought this website. You can find all these people's Twitter information, and because every one of them write online and have these kind of things. So anything they talk about today, you can find more online later. And so that's a great thing. So now we'll move over to Cameron. And Cameron's going to talk about how video games are alive.
Yeah.
Also super weird.
So I'm Cameron Kunzelman. I'm at Georgia State University. I'm a graduate student there. yeah, I work on this sort of question, the question of life and what's the moment that we begin to call things or to say that things are alive, and what sort of ethical relationship does that necessitate? Or what kind of ethical parsing? I'm not really dealing with that here. I'm dealing a little bit more speculatively about what it would mean to think about a game as something bigger than we traditionally do. So this is my blog. I think this kind of work up front is important. This is my blog. I write it fairly regularly. If you think this talk is interesting, by all means, check that out. So I'm also an active game developer. Hey, look at mygames.com is where you'll find most of my stuff. Okay, so I, like Daniel, I'm going to read off my phone, but as you can tell, I have a lot of neuroses, so I'm going to walk around and move a whole lot. All right, so I've been talking about being a game developer. I've made a couple things that you might have seen that sort of hit what Theorizing the Web might care about. So Slavoj Žižek makes a Twine game where I wrote about Slavoj Žižek making a Twine game. And the game that I think might be in the art thing, I believe. I don't know, someone can confirm deny, I don't know. So it's about Foucault, and you have to hit buttons to run away. But we're going to start here today with Leotard. So I want to start in conversation with Jean-Francois Leotard, who is a strange and divisive figure. Earlier this week, I was having a Facebook conversation about Leotard, as you do, and the person I was speaking with said they thought Leotard was a little too slippery. I want to acknowledge here that I'm starting somewhere slippery, with slippery thoughts and moving into strange and uncharted territory. You'll see that in the slides I've populated with creatures of the sea, with water, with cell walls, and systems so complex that diagrams can barely be read as diagrams. We live in weird times, in a weird world that's always been that way. The only thing I can think to do is to address it with the tools I can scrape together on short notice, and that's what this talk is sort of about. Leotard's preface to the Inhuman, a book of lectures delivered in various places and capacities, asks a simple question. What if what is proper to humankind were to be inhabited by the inhuman? End quote. Leotard spends several pages answering his own question, and I think that the current spectrum of post-human, non-human, and ecological studies has resolutely proved that the world of the human is wholly populated by non-human agency, whether those non-humans are Latour's Eremy, Liz Gross's worms, or Jane Bennett's assemblage of gutter trash that she so lovingly describes in Vibrant Matter. I want to remix Leotard a little bit, asking a new question. What if the habitat proper to humans is inside of the inhuman? On one level, we live in a universe, in a solar system, on a planet, in an ecosystem, all of which is definitely not a human and doesn't care about us in the least, right? And so we have True Detective to bring that up as a sort of contemporary example there. On another level, one I'm much more interested in, we live within specific assemblages inside of that giant inhuman thing. Let me see what I need here. Nope, not yet. I'll pause at this. Humans are assemblages of organs that work in various capacities with one another to create a self-sustaining system with interesting, self-fulfilling functions. Video games work the same way, and they organize and operate with different organs in order to make themselves continue on in the world. To get to this point requires no small effort. The first thing that we have to do is accept that humans might not be at the top of the ontological food chain. We might not be the most sophisticated and strange system that exists, even though we're definitely both of those things. The second is taking what Donna Haraway calls the biological imagination to its actual logical limit. To take a materialist stance is to assume that something like human consciousness comes into being through the intensive interactions of lots of different and disparate systems. In other words, humans are completely contingent on a random assortment of material conditions. This fact lends us to thinking about something bigger than humans. If we can think about humans as a system that exists in a particular relationship with other systems, it isn't too much of a jump to start thinking about the scale of those other systems, right? So Donna Haraway, speaking about the scale of those systems, said this. This is a long-form quotation. I'm fascinated by changes of scale. I can't do a Donna Haraway impression. I think biological worlds invite thinking at and about different kinds of scale. At the same time, biological worlds are full of imaginations and beings developed from quite extraordinary biological architectures and mechanisms. Biology is an inexhaustible source of troping. It is certainly full of metaphor, but it is more than metaphor. I think Donna Haraway is a wonderful writer, and even better, that comes from How Like a Leaf, which is a long-form interview with her. I highly suggest checking it out. So the rest of this paper is about trying to explain the relationship between the system we call a human and the system we call a video game. I stated before that humans are organs inside of video games, but what does that actually mean? I'll follow Haraway in thinking through the biological imagination, first highlighting what the relationship between humans and video games consists of, and then doing some speculation about the lives of video games, which is that sort of my master's thesis project, which I just finished. So let's talk about baleen. Baleen is a filtration system that exists within the species set of whales that we call baleen whales. Baleen is made out of keratin and extends from the roof of the mouth of the whale in a plate made up of individual pieces, making it a uniform surface with lots of small holes. So it sort of looks like this, right? It's a very fibrous sort of looking thing, but it's made of keratin. Some whales use their baleen as a slow filtration system, moving through the ocean and catching their food sources in the plate, so sort of Jaws style, even though Jaws is not a whale. Others take huge gulps of seawater and they force it out through the baleen, leaving only the food behind. These whales are using their baleen as a regulation system for managing input and output. Baleen is an active and necessary system in the body of the whale that is taken as a given by that whale. Beyond that, there are a number of species of gastropods who live in and around the baleen plates, totally unaware of the filtration system that they operate within. Video games are leviathans, humans are baleen. We're part of these giant creatures. They need us to exist. We modulate input and output, provide them with keyboard commands, electrical signals, maintenance on their bodies. We make sure that sustenance is sustained by programming them, by assembling them, by spending an intense amount of time latched into their bodies. We help recruit other humans, create advertising campaigns, push as many other people into the video game as possible so we're not alone. When you log into a Team Fortress 2, shout out to Dan a minute ago, but when you log into a Team Fortress 2 server to see only bots and idling players, you feel a lack. There's no fun to be had, no game in that video game, and you're feeling the bad affect that video games push into their organs to make sure that they operate to full functional capacity. It's sort of a horrifying image. Okay, wait, I need to figure out. No, not yet. Spoiler for something that happens later. What's the shape of this relationship? One part is about command and the creation of a player. We've all had the experience of attempting to play a game and then being forced out by controls that don't seem to work how we want, or pacing that doesn't feel quite right, or a narrative that never really catches you. On the other end, when those experiences are pushed through, when you finally manage to adapt to the control or the narrative schema, then you normalize yourself to that rhythm. There's been a recent rash of interest in the roguelike genre, also known as the procedural death labyrinth, if you like your technical terms. The general idea of these games is that the difficulty is very high, and difficulty is very high, and death necessitates starting over from an arbitrary point. Sometimes that's the very beginning of the game, sometimes that's a bonfire earlier in the case of something like Dark Souls, which we just had up on the screen. The love for this genre of games stems from the incredible amount of player knowledge and twitch reflex that mastering the game requires. For example, the game Spelunky is full of environmental hazards and enemies that will kill the player, and it's very common to die within the first 5 minutes of playing over and over and over again until you begin to understand some of the basic moves the game is making. So adaptation is key there. One friend of mine remarked recently that her one experience with Spelunky involved her throwing a rock into the air, and it bounces off of a wall, it knocked her out, and then she fell off a ledge onto some spikes and died. And that's an incredibly common play experience. That might be the play experience of Spelunky. So, however, playing games like Spelunky or Dark Souls or the even more difficult Masocore genre are important pressure points in understanding how the great Inhuman video game disciplines its organs. These are the extreme cases, but they illustrate a process. The video game washes over its human organ, putting intense pressure on it to perform and drawing it closer to optimum operating capacity. This is Michel Foucault's docile body being gang pressed not by a military regime or an asylum, but by another organism. This is the forced becoming parasite of the human. However, it's important to note that these games that glorify difficulty and the intense training of the human are mostly outliers. Candy Crush Saga is an unthinkable creature within which most of us are but a single part. It lives on without us, in the individual, and moves like a contagion across biological and mechanical hardware. Video games, these strange organisms, are distributed in time and space. They are local, and yet they're everywhere. They live on like a virus as long as they have a host, but like a seed, they will regrow if preserved and discovered long after original organs have died. And we now have a very extensive subfield of game studies that are all about discovering games that in that sort of seed form that we haven't played in a long time. William S. Burroughs claimed that language was a virus that had made humans unknown hosts and victims, and that control of individuals was only possible through manipulation of that virus. In other words, we are infected with the process that makes us controllable. I would say that we are infected not only with the word, but with the game, which isn't an atomized small thing that has wormed its way into humans, but instead is a giant being which has managed to worm humans into it. This is very scary. sort of spoiled. So running toward the end of this talk, I want to speculate about this thing we call the video game. Totally opaque to us, it is more than likely as unaware of us as we are of our own heart. We're thrown into disarray when it betrays us, stops working, hitches for a moment, but mostly we exist in harmony with that organ until it kills us. So here's Willem Flusser writing about a society of ants. So this is how I sort of want to think about the life of the video game or how it works. So this is Flusser. It is an individual, albeit on a higher level than that of an individual organism. The functions of the individual ants are not social, but biological. The queen ant does not behave toward a worker as a general does a common soldier. No, their relationship is rather like that between a stomach and a liver. The society of an anthill operates according to biological rather than political rules. If myrmecological politics could be said to exist, it would come into play only between one anthill and another, never between individual ants. So this necessitates a sort of moment of fiction. I'll try to speculate only for a moment about the life that video games live. Video games move through an undifferentiated world. They do not experience signal and noise. They experience signal and absence. When they move to orient toward a new organ, to bring it into their body, they sometimes leave an old one. From electronic input to electronic input, they maneuver. They don't have any concept of their own finitude. If they could spread to cover the world, they would feel no different. Sometimes they touch one another and an organ peels off. Their power is diminished, but they don't perceive it. They're uncaring. And these are things I was supposed to scroll through when I was doing that, but I didn't do that. So I'll end on this image. This is a screenshot from a speed run of a video game, and this is from Awesome Games Done Quick 2013, which is a big charity event that's done every year. Speedrunning is a competitive activity where players attempt to make their way through games as fast as possible, ultimately vying for the fastest in the world. This is a perfect illustration of how video games operate. This person has perfect muscle memory for the game. They've probably spent a few thousand hours playing and existing as a dedicated organ, and the game will never leave their muscles or their mind. They will never be able to disconnect fully. A moment ago I said that video games orient toward new organs, and this is the primary method through which that process occurs. The internet and its streaming connective possibilities, that's the primary vector for contagion. The short distance between connections and the immediacy of those connections means that video games are able to grab and assimilate better than ever. Video games are leviathans, humans are organs, the internet is an ocean. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Cameron. That was interesting and awesome. So now we're going to open up now to Q&A. We have quite a bit of time, actually. You guys did a good job staying under, so that's pretty amazing. I'm very confident that doesn't happen. So yeah, Shane, what's up?
First of all, panelists, very well done. Very interesting presentation. I guess this question's for Cameron. So if you're talking about video games being live, what I immediately go to is Twitch plays Pokemon.
Sure, absolutely.
So how do the humans aren't really humans? They are a composite of actions.
Sure.
So how does the human as organ system that you propose fit into that particular model you've created?
I mean, I think that the Twitch Plays Pokemon, so if everyone's not familiar with this, Twitch Plays Pokemon was where someone hooked up the first Pokemon, maybe Pokemon Red, I think was actually the version we get. So they're streaming that, and they have an input that's going from this Twitch chat. So, well, we don't have it on the thing, but in Twitch, there's a video window and there's a chat channel, and you can talk to the people who are playing or the other people in the chat room. And so, so what they were doing is they had it so you could put inputs into the chat channel, and that would then go into the game, so people were playing it. I think that's just an illustration, like the most sort of beautiful illustration of what I'm trying to get at, right? That we are to the game itself, right, ontologically, at its very existing point. We are to it only a series of inputs, and we can exist in, we could be 50,000 of us, or we can be a single one of us, right? That's what I'm trying to get at when talking about contagion and the internet as a sort of vector point, right? That widely dispersed across the game's body. Does that make sense? Is that a sufficient answer?
So it's not like we're a heart, but we're more like a nerve or
sure.
Impulse.
Sure.
Great, thank you.
Awesome. Thanks.
All right, anyone else? Yes.
Yeah, I have a question for Catherine. At the end of your presentation, you mentioned that for Russian games, capital is not really that important compared to national culture. Is this correct?
It depends on your kind of question.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering, I was just interested in learning like what kind of Russian national culture that they promote? Is there like, is it like, do they follow like a conventional conception of Russian national culture? Or are they open for interpretations?
So when I said that capital wasn't so important, and cringing away from that, I meant that I want to kind of move away a little bit from always wondering kind of where the money's coming from, and because so much of the gaming sphere in Russia is to do with informal networks and piracy and all this kind of thing. So it's hard for me to explain that in a way that makes sense in this kind of talk. To speak to your question about culture, I think the Russian gaming scene is a fair bit younger than in the West. So whereas, Cameron talked about experimental games and all these crazy things that people try to push, and Dan talked about the 10 years of games that we've read around one is a game. Russia is still kind of experiencing a lot of that. I really struggled to find academic work from Russia. I found some blogs that were talking about it, but a lot. So yeah, very generally when you look at the Russian games that are available, they're drawing upon Russian language books, they're remaking films, they're looking at folk characters, they're emphasizing military history. They are often sort of rethinking the Soviet Union and making kind of coded references to various historical events. So I would say a lot of it is, it feels very mainstream in terms of the wider Russian culture. Does that make sense? Yes.
Another question, yes.
This is for Daniel. Have you come across like Second Life yet, or are you like?
As far as like
have you done any work or so? Because
I'm not going to touch Second Life in my own research, but yeah, I'm very like the online economies and Edward Castor wrote about that as well as Lawrence Lessig wrote a lot about Second Life and the kind of like quandaries of property relations in that world and stuff like that. Super interesting. Yeah, it'll be something I definitely have to like deal with. I think I'm trying to but the difference for me between Second Life and a game like CounterStrike, Global Offensive, or Team Fortress 2 is that Second Life was more like a virtual environment rather than a kind of a place that's kind of set up as like play, which is what CounterStrike and Team Fortress are. And so I think like really focusing on those places that are about play and fun or competitiveness or all those kinds of stuff, and like trying to understand how value is being created or extracted from those spaces is like really interesting to me.
Other questions? Anyone else? William, one more time? Oh, your team will say we're here. Yeah. Swing the mic so it's involved. Yeah. You come over here, yeah. It's like the price is right.
I guess I'm curious, like, this is for Daniel. I guess I'm curious, sort of, so if we're getting into these really complicated systems of value creation and wealth extraction, like, what might be an example of sort of non-compliance or the equivalent of like a wildcat strike or breaking tools or?
Yeah, like that's one of the things I don't know. Like I have no idea, and it's not clear if there's any like other than just like people being disenchanted and stopping to work, like and stopping to plan these things. And I think maybe for me that's about thinking about it as a tendency rather than, because like right now it is still that kind of like playing at being a post-industrial worker, and when you're playing at it, you can just turn off the computer and it's no big deal. Well, I think what would be a more likely place for the first kinds of visions of that, kind of like breaking tools or striking, would be something like if people get so fed up with the Steam Greenlight service, which is where independent developers are encouraged to submit their video games into the Greenlight system, then be rated by the community, and then be given access to the actual marketplace to sell their games. That system has been so, like, people hate it, people don't like it, it's a popularity contest, and the fact that it's also a make or break for so many people's careers, like, you get on Steam, that's a solid stream of money for you. Like, that you could make your career out of that stuff, especially as a small developer. So I think that if that system continues to be really broken, people like ferment will probably happen at first, and then might spill over into the kinds of places that I'm talking about. Hey.
This is for Cameron. Does this work? Yeah, I really like how you use Foucault and speak of docile bodies and how you combine the naturalistic metaphors. And I'm wondering where you locate the game designer in all of this. So is that, since you speak of organs and water and creatures, so is the designer a godlike person that brings those creatures into being? It's especially nice because you're also a game designer. So
Who is God?
Yeah, I know. That's a great question. I mean, partially this sort of vein of research, right? And as I said at the beginning of the talk, this is my master's thesis, and so I have a whole chapter on Foucault, which that might be worth reading if you're interested in that. It's sort of to avoid what Dan's always on about political economy. I just don't want to deal with it anymore, or that I don't think it maybe gets to the actual like metaphysical question of what is a game. And so I sort of think in a weird way that the designer's sort of out. I don't really care, which is weird because I have a lot of like animus toward new criticism, and I think that like good historical methods are really important. But in this sort of branch of research or what I'm trying to think about what is a game, right? As opposed to like something that we're operating on as humans, and how do we reconfigure or rethink their actual relationships that are happening? Just don't care about the game designer so much. And it's something I definitely need to deal with more, or put more thought into it, so I have a better answer to your question than this. But that's where I sort of landed with it now. It's a weird sort of like self-effacing self-hatred as a game designer, right? To be like, I made a thing, but okay. But yeah, thank you.
So I guess I've got a question for Daniel. I see what you're saying about Steam, and immediately what comes to mind is what developers are going through with the Apple Store and with Android and mobile. So do you see what you're discussing in terms of, and you're really talking about the crafters of individual products, the guns, the skins, but do you see the extension of the work to those other markets? And if so, what's the implication? What's the future of those markets if Steam is sort of the canary in the mine?
Yeah, I think just more and more, like I think rabble rousing. I mean, I do think people will increasingly become like frustrated to levels of because as we're increasingly being told that we're all supposed to be these kinds of creative, people, that we're always supposed to be manufacturing tons of things to sell on these digital markets. But as we know, like the only pages that really matter in the App Store or in a place like Steam or whatever is the first couple of pages, in the same way that the only page that matters in Google is the first page, right? So when you don't get access to it, and this comes with attention economies as well as like production of, I think like effective economies and stuff like that, right? Like like what it, and it doesn't jive with kind of the amount of people that need to be making money and making a wage to this kind of stuff, and the fact that only an extremely tiny amount of people are going to benefit from these systems.
And the bonus is that Apple and Android and Google are taking a cut.
Every time.
Yeah,
every time.
Yeah. Other questions? Yes, here.
And also, do we have questions from Twitter? Is that a thing we need to?
Oh, yeah, you have to.
Okay.
You silenced the masses.
Twitter didn't even respond.
Yeah.
This is for Daniel. So recently Blizzard closed the Diablo 3 real money auction house.
Yeah.
What do you think their motivations were for that, even though presumably they were still making money for it? And what do you think we've learned from that?
I think the real money auction house, like, that's and again, complete speculation. I haven't read enough about it. I guess it's too much trouble to try and run those things. With the Steam marketplace, you're only allowed to put $500 maximum in your wallet, or is it $500? And I think the maximum sale price of anything that you sell is $400. Because I think anything more than that, they get into like money regulation issues. Like, because it's a great way to launder money. Like, I would be laundering money in these kinds of systems left and right if I could, right? In the same way that Bitcoins would get for that. Like, you could probably do it pretty effectively if they allowed you to put more money into it. I imagine the auction house is probably just like either the community didn't work with it, or it's just too much effort to like try and create a marketplace that isn't always dwindling towards zero, because almost all the commodities, I have a whole Gmail folder full of them, of the things I've sold, where it's like the first day it's like $2, and the next day it's $1.50, and the day after that it's like things are selling for between 2 cents and 3 cents, and it just stays flat forever. And I think the massive depreciation of all these kinds of digital commodities is really like a problem that takes a lot of work. Valve is committed to it. Because I think Valve is really committed to not making games anymore. I think they want to get into doing everything other than making games, because they realize that if they can be at the bleeding edge of that, they're going to benefit greatly from building support like Steam. They make probably way more money from Steam than from like selling Half-Life and all that kind of stuff now. So.
Do we have some other questions? Anything else?
Okay, go for it. This is a question for Cam and Dan. My sense of Cam, that your sort of metaphysical inquiry into what is a game is meant to provide an analytic framework that gets out of, say, an anthropocentric model. Which is to say that it's a way to kind of think different in a way. And Dan, your talk was about the concentration of capitalism, the movement of capitalism into these new spaces. And so I feel like one is like Cam, yours was sort of optimistic in that sense, and yours was sort of pessimistic, and that's not to put a value judgment on it, but I was wondering if either of you or both of you could speak to whether or not there is some sort of way to kind of link those two notions about thinking of games as a site of difference and thinking about games as the opposite of that, like as a process of homogenization and intensification.
No, go.
I mean, it's a straightforward, simple question.
Yeah. Back of envelope. Yeah, well, I mean, I guess what's really important for me is just thinking about not so much that games have to be like this, it's just that they are right now, right? And I don't know, like, I mean, it's interesting because, like, when you talk about how, like, games could envelop the world and not care, right? Like, I think about, like, these systems don't, like, they're, in their own sense, like, they're, amoral, like, political, like, they think of themselves that way, right? And so, like, they, Steam and these kinds of games and markets and all that kind of stuff can spread far and wide and still don't care about it, right? So, what was that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I do not have a good answer. It's a really good question.
Yeah.
I'll try it later.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Well, I guess just like, I'm not sure if we need to reconcile that kind of like that problem between pessimism and the kind of like, or at least the optimism of thinking about games beyond as leviathans and these things that are kind of their own unique things.
So here's a real answer. So Staffen Bjork and Jesper Juhl have a paper called Zero Player Games where they talk about the idea of the zero player game. And there are a few of those that are sort of like that. So The Incredible Machine, if you like Build a Machine, it's a Rube Goldberg device simulator basically. There are a few of Lemmings is a game that's sort of in there for them. And so that's sort of a place that I start with, right? Like, can there be a game without a player, right? And what's the minimal role that we can think of there? And so it's really interesting that you categorize what I'm saying as sort of positive. Because I'm sort of thinking about the bleak hellscape, post-human, where games live on forever and bring alternate elements or themselves into relationship with one another. I guess I'm sort of thinking of the end point of Steam, right? Like, what's the economy without? What is the full political economy in which humans no longer have to matter? It's just the Matrix. But it's pretty cool, right?
All right, is there anybody else? All right, let's give Catherine, Dan, and Cam a round of applause. I thought it was really great.